but he's hungry. The fieldfares, screaming with anger, converge on their enemy. And now threat turns into direct action. They mob him. Thoroughly intimidated by the commotion, the raven retreats. But the fighters press home their attack. The raven is brought down. And now they bomb him with their droppings.
Yum.
Soiled feathers soon become waterlogged, and that could be crippling, even fatal. Thoroughly cowed, the raven retreats. The colony is saved thanks to its members' highly effective system of communication between themselves and with their enemy.
Cool. Hold on. Okay. So this is an interesting behavior, right? What we have is this. Why do the fieldfares poop on the raven? Well, they're not quite strong enough to, kill it or injure it easily. But the poop is actually somewhat harmful because it might break down some of the oil waterproofing protection that feathers normally have, and that could be actually a costly event for the raven. So, I mean, they're trying to make the raven leave the area. That's why they're same reason why monkeys throw their poop at us. Fatima, yes. Uric acid.
Sorry, I
Hello?
accidentally pressed that.
Okay. So what's interesting about this behavior, mobbing, is that the raven's in the area and it's only going to attack one nest, at least one nest at a time. But many individuals from this group will join together to fend off this raven. And this behavior comes at not a huge risk, but some risk to every individual. Less and less risk the more join in. But the benefit is only going to go to one nest at a time. So why do you think the fieldfares work together to fend off the raven? Okay, let's see what we got. Well, in the long term, there's the potential that it will help more than one nest. Why would that be? So all of these ideas, safety and numbers. So I'm going to write some of these guys down. That's what I should do. Here we go. Watch this. So we're seeing, hopefully we're watching the chat, but let's see. So we're getting a couple that are going to go together probably. So one I'm seeing is, okay, work as a tribe. What is a tribe? How would you define a tribe? Carpenter. In other words, what binds that tribe together? I won't make you try to read my mind. A group that has unity. I'm going to say one possible thing is it could be the group that lives near each other. But another possibility would be, another possibility might be, are the individuals related, right? And as you know, we're going to see from Dawkins and other readings, relatedness could play a huge role, because if the chicks in that other nest that are being attacked share genes with you, you might be helping your own fitness. But another suggestion that came up before is this quid pro quo. And another word for this, I don't know how many of us have read far enough along in Dawkins to have read about this. What's the magic word for quid pro quo in behavioral ecology, behavior? Starts with an R. That's right, reciprocity. So the idea would be that birds join in to defend against the raven when it's attacking one nest one day, and hopefully later the birds that were actually saved will reciprocate, will return that, and help mob birds later, the raven later, when it's threatening another bird. Now the problem is, the problem with reciprocity, which we'll be talking about, is that it might be hard to enforce, and it depends on a bunch of things, like that there's long-term associations that would allow for those favors to be returned. Maybe that there's the potential to punish. Maybe the ability to recognize cheaters and then not reciprocate with them. So we're going to be talking quite a bit about reciprocity, but that's a possibility. And a bunch of these other, so it's really interesting. So there are a bunch of interesting answers, and note that they're going to fall under different, under sort of different levels of analysis. In other words, a sense of community may well be a proximate mechanism underlying the behavior of cooperation to defend against a predator. But the question then becomes, why was it adaptive for bird brains to develop a sense of community, and or for humans, right? And so that's going to be the challenge, because it's possible that the bird that hides in its nest when everyone else is defending against the predator doesn't get attacked by the raven and doesn't risk itself by sticking its neck out. So these are the challenges to explaining cooperative behavior in animals and humans. I think I'm going to finish the slides, and then I'll want us to talk a little bit about the Dawkins video. Okay. And so Dan points out that if all the birds were selfish, then they would all get picked off one by one. And that's absolutely true. The whole point of Dawkins is that at every point, as each one is getting picked off individually, the rational behavior and genes that don't have emotions are only going to be shaped by natural selection. Genes should favor rational, selfish individuals that let other members of the group take the risk of mobbing and don't mob themselves. And that's sort of the paradox and the challenge, because birds do mob as a group. And then it's an even greater challenge for human behavior, because we actually cooperate on a scale with non-relatives in a way that is different from any other animal. Okay, so I, of course, started sharing the wrong slides, so now I'm back. So what Dawkins was responding to, or actually what Dawkins was popularizing, was the work of G.C. Williams, George Williams, and also Bill Hamilton, that was responding itself to a sort of poorly thought out theory of social behavior in animals that was very common in the 50s and 60s. So there's of course a question of why do we often see altruistic behavior in the wild? And while we're here, could someone define altruism? Really, just the simplest definition? Helping others without gain for yourself? Exactly. At your own expense. That's probably better than just without gain. So it's worse than neutral. It's helping others at some cost to self. Cool. There you go. So there were a number of people that interpreted much behavior in non-human animals as altruistic, because it seemed to benefit others at their own cost. And the thinking was that selection operates on the level of groups or species, and that species that had more altruistic members would be more successful, have higher average fitness and reproductive success, and become more common. And so this was sort of exemplified, or at least made, the sort of implicit was made explicit by V.C. Wynne Edwards. I read the book. It's amazing. He's explaining, trying to explain dispersal patterns in birds, dispersion. And so, well, I'll do the general thing from the slide, and then I'll talk about some specific examples. So Wynne Edwards' argument was that overproduction is wasteful. And when he's saying overproduction, he's mostly meaning overproduction of offspring. Right, so sorry, I'm trying to crank up the pen. Come on. Oop, my pen fell asleep. Usually I just make students do that, but here we go. Overproduction of offspring. And so the idea being, if you have too many offspring, you won't be able to feed them all, right? And in fact, mortality could be higher, and the surviving number of offspring could be less. And so the idea was that groups, even though you'd think from Darwin, fitness, reproductive success, whoever has the most children wins, Wynne Edwards is arguing that groups or species that are less wasteful and more restrained, so they're taking less food to feed their own chicks and leaving more food around for others, that's a form of altruism, would have better survival. And he looked at a number of patterns. One is sort of reproductive effort in uh, uh, this is Great Tits from Witham Wood. We have chickadees, birds in the spirit and genus Paridae. In Europe, they call chickadees tits. So, but they're all closely related there. So they're both New and Old World. Great birds to study because they're non-migratory and they store lots of seeds and they breed in nest boxes. So you should also know that like 90% of what we know about birds we've learned from birds that breed in nest boxes because they're much easier to study. And you can do things like manipulate density. You put out more nest boxes, you get more birds. And so there's this long-term study at Witham Wood in Oxford. And what they observed was that at higher densities, so our x-axis in this figure is population density. I think it's like nest boxes per square kilometer. You have smaller numbers of eggs. So clutch is number of eggs. And what you can see is at very low densities, they're laying 9, 10, 11 eggs typically. And then at high density, they're laying 6, 7 eggs per clutch. And I think there's one other slide before. Oh, and then the other pattern was that at high density, a smaller proportion of pairs would lay a second brood, right? So this is, and when Edwards interpreted this as the animals restraining themselves, what's the unit of density? So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm 70% sure because I've read this paper, but not the book, but not super recently, is nesting pairs per square kilometer. Okay, so when Edwards interpreted this to say at higher densities, the birds were restraining their reproduction in order that the chickadees would not starve, all the members of the group. What is an alternative explanation for this pattern? This is just combining fecundity. Fecundity is here, you know, total eggs laid. So it includes first and second clutch. And it's a nice curve, right? Everyone can see there's a huge thing. So the question is, and I'll type it into chat. When Edwards interpreted this as the birds restraining themselves altruistically so that all the birds in the woods wouldn't starve. What is another possible ultimate explanation for this pattern of laying fewer eggs and having a second clutch less often under high density? Yeah. So another possibility is that every bird is trying desperately to lay as many eggs as it can, but at high densities, yes, at high densities, it's possible that they just aren't able to amass enough resources to lay large clutches, right? So Dan, it's not at high there aren't fewer adults at high density. There's lots of adults. They just make fewer eggs. So yeah, a bunch of folks. Yeah, so the question is, why are they having fewer offspring at high density? And a bunch of students have suggested maybe it's just that at high density the resources are more limited because they're competing for these resources and they're just not able to lay more eggs. So how would you test between these two hypotheses? One, altruistically reducing their fecundity, or two, they're being constrained. So Fatima, that is exactly what Wynne Edwards was suggesting. And also, so I'm excited to have chat. It's really good that I get to see these questions and stuff, but maybe you should shoot me an email if you don't want me calling you out by name, or if it's okay to call you out by name. I mean, the funny thing is both I will be mispronouncing most of your names, and two, I have no idea what anyone looks like. In any event, Fatima, that argument is what Wynne Edwards was making. And so then the alternate is, so Wynne Edwards is saying they're working together. Somehow the genes are being selected to favor cooperative behavior, that no one tries to have too many kids when densities are really high. Alternative explanation, both completely consistent with the observational data, is that everyone's trying to lay as many eggs as they can, but because of competition at high densities, they just can't get enough food to lay large clutches. So how would we, well, actually in humans with expensive housing, right, and expensive education, and we will totally talk about the demographic transition in this course, because that is a fascinating topic for thinking about you know, adaptive behavior and stuff. What's an experiment that could maybe have us distinguish between those two hypotheses? Okay, so I will also point out that, yes, what do you mean by control for resources? I will point out that when we're doing like papers and stuff, the like last step of a successful paper is always to suggest a follow-up question and an experiment that could address it. The hypothesis, there are two hypotheses, right? One, birds are working together. They don't want anyone to starve, and so when it's more crowded, they suppress their own reproduction. Alternately, so so you could reduce the population density of the birds and see if clutch size goes up, but note that both hypotheses would predict clutch size goes up at lower density. Okay.
Professor, I was
What?
going to say,
Yes.
sorry, it was taking me too long to type, so I was going to just speak.
Great.
I was going to say maybe limit resources in two different groups and observe the behavior.
So I was thinking that, although maybe the opposite. In other words, supplement resources at high density areas.
Okay, either
And
way.
then see, right? And then if you just put out feeding stations and then see whether the birds lay more eggs in response to food supplementation. So they'll still be at high density. They'll have all the social cues that resources might be constrained, because the interesting thing about birds and egg laying is that, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. The highest energetic time for a bird reproducing is not laying the eggs. It's actually later on when the chicks are large and just fledging. And actually, right when they fledge, when they're large enough that they have to eat a lot, they're not good at feeding themselves, but they're mobile enough they can harass their parents. So people have done, well, the the idea is if the birds are responding to density by restraining themselves out of altruism, if the density is high, they should lay fewer eggs. If the birds are trying to lay as many eggs as possible, then if you supplement food, that should increase their fecundity, even at high density. And that experiment's actually been done a bunch of times, and birds are highly responsive to food supplementation and will lay more eggs. Many species will lay larger clutches when given more food. I would say the funny thing is people haven't actually done that experiment to test for altruism because of the theoretical biology work that Dawkins writes about. In other words, G.C. Williams and other sort of behavior modelers were so convincing that the altruism argument breaks down that people haven't even really been sort of testing fecundity density as a question of altruism, but they've done a lot of work on nutritional limitations in clutch size and response to food availability, and there usually is an effect of food supplementation. Cool. So this is another example of sort of cooperative and potential and seemingly altruistic behavior that has been studied by Amot Zahavi to ask this question, like, are adaptations for sort of direct reproductive success, or is the function of costly helpful behavior to display your quality because you're able to do things at a cost and still survive? What am I talking about? So these are Arabian babblers. I took these pictures, oh my goodness, like 16 years ago in the Negev desert. And you can see it's from a well-studied population because this little guy has, rings. And Arabian babblers, but I never studied them. They're just like an animal behavior kind of classic. These animals are known for they are cooperative breeders. Young from previous years will help their parents raise young, and they live together in groups of families plus unrelated individuals. And some individuals will take turns acting as sentinels. In other words, instead of eating, you'll have one who's there watching, looking out for predators, and that allows everyone else in the group to spend more time feeding. They're not yes, they're not guardians in the sense that they can defend against a predator, but they are lookouts. And yes, meerkats do that as well. And similarly, mostly that's among close relatives. But it's not, in babblers, it's not just individual family groups. And Zahavi argues that the sentinel behavior is a display that will help them rise in status in the groups where they are and be more likely to gain access to mates because they show that they're in such good condition that they can afford risky behavior and they don't have to just eat and hide. So this fundamental question, one of the ones we'll be dealing with in this course, is what are adaptations for what sort of level does selection act on? Are they for the good of the species? And there are, behaviors that appear altruistic, that they help a group at a cost to the self. like sentinel behavior in babblers and meerkats. And as Wynne Edwards argued that for other examples, Wynne Edwards argued that the reduction and ritualization of aggressive displays was done as an altruistic behavior, whereas, and Lawrence was the one who like pointed out that sort of animals with greater weaponry often had more ritualized displays rather than actual fighting. But again, and other examples of Wynne Edwards is movement behavior, dispersion of individuals to match the concentration of food, and cannibalism to reduce overpopulation. So the funny thing is that all of these are examples from Wynne Edwards' writing, and each example can also be perhaps more parsimoniously explained by selection on the individual level. In other words, cannibalism to reduce overpopulation might be helping the species, but cannibalism might give you a nutritional benefit, and especially like, I mean, even eating your own offspring, if your own offspring's chance of survival is low, but your chance of survival is higher, then it may pay for you to cut your losses 1 year, live for another year, and have more offspring. Similarly, when Edwards explained individuals leaving dense areas to move to other areas in seabirds as a way of reducing the sort of strain on the population where they originated, can be explained just as easily as individuals avoiding competition and trying to find areas with a greater selfish rate of return and a greater rate of energy gain. So that just means that these patterns, they don't prove themselves. In other words, they're compatible with adaptations on a species or on an individual level. And so you need sort of a theoretical, basically you need math to even see whether altruistic behaviors could possibly evolve. Okay, so we already defined altruism before. I will just point out that in this course, I'm going to be talking about the fitness consequences of behavior, as opposed, as opposed to what we would call psychological altruism. Which philosophers argue about. They argue about whether altruism exists because if any behavior, which is, and by psychological altruism, I mean a behavior which is done with the intention of helping others and not for a selfish motive. And the sort of paradox of psychological altruism is it like depends on your like philosophy of motivation of behavior. Like you might think that like any behavior that we do is motivated. I mean, it could be motivated either by fear or by, you know, some kind of dopamine, serotonin sort of, you know, reward in our brain. And so if the unselfish behavior is rewarding on some level, then is it altruistic or not? So that's an exciting rabbit hole that I am not going to answer. I'm just going to sort of point out that it's an interesting question sort of in psychology and in philosophy. And some people argue that nothing is altruistic because on some level you're enjoying doing it. And others argue that it is. We're not worried about that. Well, that's the question, like whether you're depressed or not depressed. I mean, it's true that it's possible that no behavior would make you happy, but there could be some, on some mental level, where some part of you is feeling rewarded by doing the right thing. right? And then the question is that still altruism, or are you just doing it for the selfish kicks of feeling like a good person? Anyway, I'm just going to leave that there as an interesting philosophical question. And we are not, and this course is more talking about the sort of, is a gene for an altruistic trait expected to increase in frequency or decrease in frequency? Dawkins argues it must, almost by definition, decrease in frequency. David Sloan Wilson, Peter Turchin, Richardson, and Boyd and Henrik are going to be arguing the other side. But they're not going to be arguing it the way Wynne Edwards did, because Wynne Edwards was like, I mean, better biologist than me, but in this context, his ideas had not been tested yet. And so the way they were expressed, they were really fuzzy. So George Williams pointed out that sort of evolutionarily, if you do a bunch of models, and we will be doing some models in Excel, that a group of altruists is always invasible by selfish mutants. In other words, if you have a group where individuals that share in certain behaviors, like defending against predators, like cooperating against invading groups, at a personal risk to themselves, the average fitness of those groups will be much higher than groups of selfish individuals. However, a single selfish individual within a group of altruists gets all of the shared benefit of altruistic behavior without paying the individual cost of altruistic behavior. And so genes that favor selfishness will always do well, especially within a group of altruists. And so, I'm trying to preview lots of the course with the introduction. What's going to be sort of critical. So a group of altruists is always invasible by selfish mutants. Let me type something. While the average fitness, and I'm using that pretty much altruistically, alternately with reproductive success, which is survival and fecundity, of altruists for example. So while the average fitness of every member of a group of altruists may be much higher than the average fitness of a group. You can't see what I'm typing? Con! Okay. So other people in chat, let me know. And okay, so two things. Okay, I got it. Stop telling me. I'm either going to paste it, I'm either going to hit return and you'll see it, or I will copy it into chat. Okay, but I'm going to keep typing it on the screen. And I'm copying what I had so far. Okay, so while the average fitness, or defined as reproductive success, of every member of a group of altruists working together may be much higher than the average fitness of a group of selfish individuals. So if everyone stayed in their own group, the altruists would win? No, if I refreshed, I would actually like the collab session. Horrible things would happen. Lightning, you saw what happened last night. That was probably coming from refreshing the screen somewhere on a collaborate session. The problem is that a single selfish individual and that selfish individual could be an immigrant, I don't mean from another country, I mean like from the next tribe over or the next group of animals, immigrant or mutant, an individual from within the group whose, you know, gamete had a mutation and now they're behaving selfishly, will gain the shared benefit fully, but avoid the individual costs for altruistic behavior and thus have higher fitness and increase in frequency. Okay, so we hit return, we see what happens, nothing happens, but I can do this text, so I'm gonna copy. Does it appear now? Okay, there you go. So that's what Williams is saying. You're gonna see it, you're gonna read that clearly in Dawkins and probably in Henrik. So this argument is really powerful, right? It's and it's probably the reason why in animals there are many examples of highly cooperative, helpful behavior, and like 95% of the time it's directed towards close kin. And the rest of the time it's probably directed towards familiar individuals who have a chance and do reciprocate. Although interestingly, sometimes that altruistic behavior is enforced by punishment, which is an interesting thing. We're going to talk a lot about what's called strong reciprocity. I'm not going to write it down because it's an idea that we're going to get to later in the course, but it's going to be really important. So sometimes people behave altruistically because you know, altruism might be favored, but sometimes individuals are going to be behaving altruistically because they're being made to, which is something that was not as appreciated in the 70s. Okay, so we're going to spend quite a bit more time on the levels of selection. So to kind of summarize this whole sort of history, if we were talking about Darwin through 1950s, different arguments would be made at different times that selection was operating on the level of sometimes individuals, sometimes species, sometimes groups, sometimes traits. Maynard Smith and G.C. Williams, the people who actually did the pioneering work that Dawkins popularized. That's the thing. Dawkins was not a novel thinker. He just wrote an incredibly influential book talking about work done by John Maynard Smith and George Williams. Argued that it happens overwhelmingly on the level of individuals, and that kinship was a way to show how helpful behavior was favored selfishly. And that's Dawkins actually, when he says replicators, he's sort of talking about genes, except that he's really talking about individuals, because Dawkins spends very little time talking about selfish genes in the way they'd be understood now, which would be things like segregation disorders, genes that prevent alternate alleles from going into gametes. Those are selfish genes. That's what a selfish gene is. And there are actually very few selfish genes. So he's really talking about individuals as well. Okay. Oh, so Dimitri asks, is there, so the general point of the question is there a balance, which I'm going to stick a name on because we want to be good with that. When he says balance, is there like frequency dependence? And we're going to talk about frequency dependence a bunch. So I just made the argument, though, Williams' argument, that if you have a lot of altruists around to exploit, selfish individuals will have very high fitness because there's all this helpful behavior they're benefiting from, but they are not suffering the cost. But then Dimitri is asking, what about if everyone's selfish? Does it pay to be altruistic? And I would argue, at least at this point in the course, no. And the best argument for it is Catch 22, when I forget the guy's name. He's arguing with Major Major. I mean, it's the protagonist. It's what the book's about. And he's saying, like, you know, we're here dying in this war, and you know, most men my age are actually still buying and selling things and making money. I want to quit this war. And then his commanding officer is like, well, if everyone felt that way, then we'll lose the war, and we'll all die. And he's like, well, if everyone feels that way, I definitely don't want to be the only sucker running up that hill with my gun, because I'll definitely get killed. And so actually, frequency dependence is not operating here. In other words, what about the offspring of the selfish individual? Well, the idea is that if behaviors are affected by genes, the selfish individual will have more offspring, and those offspring will have received that genes for selfishness from their parent, and so the trait of selfishness will increase in frequency within groups. So to answer Fatima's question, we're mostly talking about theoretical models. However, we won't, like later on we'll talk about concrete examples, although the concrete examples where the genetics have been well worked out are often things like slime molds, where the question of being selfish or altruistic seems really boring, but it's like, are you going to behave as a cell and form part of the stalk that will then be the support for the fruiting body that's going to release all the spores, or will you try only to get into the fruiting body and release spores? So there are well worked out genes for selfishness and altruism in slime molds, dictyostelium social slime molds. And so yeah, if you are good at getting into the fruiting body and becoming a spore, groups of those will not work as well as a migrating slug, and they won't make as large a stalk, and so they won't actually sort of perform as well as a group. Okay, so that's an example where the selfishness and altruism is clearly genetically determined. In other cases, and all of these models, it's just assumed. Okay, so to kind of summarize just the introduction, we have Darwin, who doesn't have a great idea about how heredity works. In fact, both Darwin and Lamarck thought that particles would accumulate in the body called gemmules that would sort of gather into the sex organs, get into gametes, and get into the offspring. And the level of selection for Darwin was usually populations. If you're confused about frequency dependence, I will tell you the definition in like a sentence, but it's not going to make sense. But it is really well explained in it's really well explained in The Selfish Gene. Dawkins does a great job when he's talking about Prisoner's Dilemma, and I left my copies. I have like 3 copies of this book, but I left one in school and one up in Ithaca, so I don't have it with me. It saddens me. I've got this one, awesome book. This one too. Actually, I might even have a PDF that I obtained back at an earlier time through mysterious circumstances, but I'm not going to look it up now. But Dawkins is great on frequency dependence. But the idea is that frequency dependence is a way of maintaining genetic variation in a population because whatever trait is rare has an advantage. And so it'll just be easy to think about different examples. The one that I always use and like generate little models of is alternate reproductive tactics in many different animals. But let's think about frogs. There are two different strategies that a male frog can take. The male can sing, and that will attract females, and whoever sings loudest attracts the most females. So if you're a really big frog, it's good to sing. But a male frog can also be silent, move as close as possible to the males who are singing, and as females approach the males who are singing, that silent male can sneak in and mate with the female until the male notices and the larger male notices and chases them away. You see this in fish as well. And so it's an interesting question, like, what's the better strategy? And the truth is, depends on the frequency of each strategy. In other words, if almost all the males are singing, there are tons of females being brought into the ponds and streams. And it's great to be a sneaker because all these females are coming in because there's so many males that are singing. But if everyone is a sneak, then females aren't coming into the streams and the ponds, so the sneakers aren't getting lots of matings. And anyone who sings will attract all the females because there are no competitors. And so while all the sneakers are competing with each other, the one that sings gets to mate with many females. So that's an example of a behavior that's probably affected by frequency dependence. Whichever behavior is rare has an advantage. Okay. So think this was mostly the summary of the Jablonka and Lamb chapter. What Weisman and sort of neo-Darwinists realized is that the germline is sort of its own thing, and it's separate from the somatic tissue, the soma of the body, and that means that you know, I mean, for humans, we now know that like an infant female is born with all the eggs that it's going to mature potentially in its lifetime, and the males continually making new sperm, but from that lines of stem cells, not from somatic tissue. And that's an incredibly important adaptation, actually, that forces all the cells in our body to behave cooperatively. The modern synthesis was the combination of, Mendelian genetics and then quantitative genetics with natural selection, showing how variation can be maintained because you don't have like blended inheritance and sort of non-workable processes like that, and how realistically measured mutation rates can account for the amount of change that we see over time. Actually, there's much more mutation than needed for adaptation. Usually that's in a large population that's just not a constraint. It's really interesting. And then you have in the 70s sort of selfish gene neo-Darwinism, where the levels of selection is now kind of firmly isolated only on the individual. However, what increases in frequency are the alleles for traits that lead to higher average fitness. So it's interesting how I would still say that the unit of evolution, it's the trait, but for Dawkins, it's really still the individual, because he really doesn't talk about truly selfish genes very much. And there's a reason why he doesn't talk about selfish genes. I mean, he uses the word selfish gene, but in the book, he's talking about selection that's acting on the level of individuals. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to, I'm going to stop the recording. I'll start it up again in a second.